Immuta recently released an enhanced integration that utilizes Databricks Unity Catalog. In today's video, we're going to walk through what that integration looks like and how Immuta can automatically scan and classify data, build policy in an easy to understand way that will enforce transparently in Unity Catalog controls, and then provide auditability and observability for query patterns and query history from Databricks environments. And so looking here at the Immuta UI, you can see a bunch of Databricks tables I've registered. I've already enabled a Unity Catalog feature in Immuta that's currently in private preview as the time of this recording. Make sure to check out the Immuta documentation and check up our newsletters because we'll actually release an alert when we release this functionality as GA. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to switch into a SQL view in Databricks. So here you're actually looking at a specific table through Databricks SQL that shows the current users that have access to a credit card transaction table. I'm currently logged in as my admin user that has admin rights in the workspace to actually create and manage tables. And so what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to show how we can define policy in Immuta that will impact the Unity Catalog permissions as well as the Unity Catalog row and column level features that are now available. And so looking at the sample data here, you'll see there's a lot of sensitive information contained in this table. And so part of what we're going to do is one, we're going to grant users select access to this table based on certain attributes. And then we're actually going to define policies that change what users can see using Unity native controls, all built by an Immuta secure policy that essentially lets you write natural language type policies to really enhance the effectiveness of policy in your organization, allowing lines of business users to now define rules that make sense without having to write all the SQL code necessary to implement it in Unity Catalog directly. So going back into the Immuta UI, I'm actually going to click into this Databricks credit card transaction table. We'll quickly look at the activities that have been done on this table. You can see I've actually created some tags. I've registered the table. Haven't actually applied any policies yet. I can then very quickly go in and see documentation that may exist in a third-party catalog solution, or you can actually build your own metadata here inside of Immuta. And then I can quickly look and see who currently has access to this table. And so by default, you can see the user who actually registered the table, which is my admin user here, is currently the only user who has access. And so we'll actually define a policy later on that changes this to automatically grant people select access based on who they are in the organization. And then the third thing we can look at is the policies tab. And currently I have no policies enabled, but the first thing when I've created and registered this table inside of Immuta that Immuta actually will do is something called sensitive data detection. And this is something that comes from the Immuta Discover module where we will automatically scan and classify data for you, as well as look for third-party catalog solutions that may already contain classification about this table. And that becomes extremely important because now you can start defining policy based on classifications instead of relying on hard-coding specific tables to have specific rules and then using hard-coded role membership to drive those policies. With Immuta, you can essentially define a rule that says who should be able to select from this table. And what I'm going to do in my example in a minute, I'm essentially going to say if we find a classified credit card number, anyone who's in finance or analytics should be able to select from that. So we'll see how Immuta allows you to drive policy based on those attributes that will natively grant select access in Unity Catalog for users of Databricks. And so one of the interesting things we do here as part of our discovery process is we actually do a lot of classification. So we actually sample the data to classify if it's PII or not. In this case, you can see additional information where I actually added this tag manually just to show that it's possible to do. And then you can see which columns in the data source actually also contain this tag. And then you can see I actually have a policy called mass PII that's not currently activated, but it actually drives rules based on that classification. And so if you had third-party catalogs like Elation or Calibra pulling tags into Immuta, you would also see those tags be registered here as well as describing where they come from. And so now what I want to do is I want to talk about the secure part of the platform. And so now what I'm going to go in and build is something called a subscription policy. And this will essentially grant select access to users based on attributes or role membership or purpose-based access. And so what you can see I've defined here is an easy to understand policy that doesn't require anyone to write SQL grant statements or go into the Databricks UI and actually manually add users. What I can do is I can essentially turn this policy on that's called a financial subscription policy. And this will grant select access to any of those tables we have in our organization that contain a credit card number. And while this integration with Unity Catalog is new, what this means now is that any platform we support that we find this type of data in this single policy can now grant select access natively in all those different platforms. And so this is going to actually go out and invoke the necessary grant statements to give my users that meet this criteria access to that credit card table we just saw in Databricks. And so if I go back into the example here and I go take a look at the permissions tab, you'll now see that I have an additional user that I'm aware of in Immuta that meets the criteria of either being in analytics or in finance. And now that user's actually been granted a select privilege on this table. And so if I go back over as the user we're looking at here, we can see before I'd actually granted them select access in the table, they weren't seeing anything in my CMC demo database. If I refresh this, you can now see they have access to the credit card transactions table, and now they're able to run queries here directly. And so again, that policy that's easy to understand, that looks at role membership, it looks at user attributes, or looks at purpose-based access controls, is now being natively enforced inside of Databricks. And the reason this is important because now users can use Immuta to protect any way they would interact with Databricks. Because Unity Catalog transcends different options you have in Databricks, if a user goes over to say interactive cluster now, and they run a query to see what access do I have against this one database, they now are using the same Immuta policy to get access to the different tables in these organizations. But going back into Databricks SQL, what I'm going to do now is I want to go back into Immuta and actually define a policy that hides the sensitive data here. Obviously, we would want to show a credit card number or a customer last name in this data set. And so I essentially want to build a policy that takes that data and redacts it. And so what I'm going to do now is go back into the Immuta UI as someone who's responsible for this data set and actually build a policy that makes sense for the organization. And so that's the second type of policy we'll talk about today, is a data policy. And so if I switch into a data policy, you can see I've actually pre-built a couple different things here. In this case, I'm actually going to build a mask policy for the PII information that we saw contained in that table. And if I jump into the policy editor, this is the real value that Immuta starts providing for organizations. Instead of having to rely on data engineering or someone who has a robust SQL expertise to actually go write these types of Unity Catalog row and column level controls, Immuta's policy engine will essentially go out and orchestrate and build these Unity Catalog controls for you based on this easy to understand policy that you're seeing here. And so as a line of business user, I can come in here and select what option I want Immuta to do. In this case, we're going to tag, mask anything that's classified as personally identifiable information using a constant of redacted for everyone in the organization. And we're actually going to tell Immuta we want to apply this anywhere we find PII data, not just restricted to this specific credit card table. And so now what you'll see is there's actually 3 of my 10 data sources that meet the criteria for this policy. And so what I'm going to do is go ahead and update this policy and save it. And then that way we can actually go see how it's being enforced. And so back on the main data policy screen, you'll see there's a mask PII field for policy, and then it's actually applying against 3 different sources. Now, what's really cool is if I jump over and show you my actual warehouse I'm using here, you can actually see Immuta creating all of the policies natively behind the scenes using Databricks native controls. So here you can actually see the Unity Catalog object that's being created behind the scenes based on that policy. And so Immuta's automatically created and pushed that function as well as associated it to all the tables we found that PII information inside of Databricks. So what that means for an end user is if they go back into their workspace now and they run their query, they're not even aware of Immuta being in the mix here, but what's going to happen is you'll notice all the PII fields that we've classified inside of Immuta are now saying redacted, because again, we built that native Unity Catalog control to go out and automatically enforce that. And so again, what that means for an user is if they go run in their interactive cluster or their Databricks SQL environment, because we're using Unity Catalog controls, that same consistent policy is now being applied everywhere we find the data set. And the other additional thing that Immuta provides is that we used to integrate with the Hive Metastore when that was the only option we had. And we still do today with our Unity Catalog integration. So what that means for you as a user of Databricks is you may still have legacy tables living in your Hive Metastore that Unity Catalog controls can't apply to. With Immuta, you can still use Immuta to write policy against those source systems, those tables that live in the Hive Metastore, while migrating them over to Unity Catalog, so you don't have to manage 2 different implementations of policy logic based on whether it's still in Hive Metastore or whether it's in Unity Catalog Metastore. So I hope you found this demo video useful. This is a high-level overview of what Immuta does. For more details, please follow the links in the description to see how our Detect module is coming out with advanced auditing capabilities.